Waitress yelled, "Get down!" and took the bullet, meant for a Hell's Angel. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Miller's Diner, casting a warm glow on the worn leather booths and chrome fixtures. Maggie Harris moved between the tables with practiced ease, coffee pot in hand, her sensible shoes quietly padding across the faded linoleum floor. "More coffee, Mr. Peterson?" she asked, already tilting the pot toward his nearly empty cup. The elderly man looked up from his newspaper with twinkling eyes. "You read my mind, Maggie, and please, how many times do I have to tell you to call me Frank?" Maggie chuckled, topping off his cup. "At least once more, Mr. Peterson. That's just how my mama raised me." She adjusted her neat white apron and tucked a stray silver curl behind her ear. The diner hummed with the quiet conversations of the morning regulars. Martha and Betty, the retired schoolteachers, sat in their usual corner booth discussing the latest book club selection. Tom, the hardware store owner, nursed his coffee at the counter while working on the daily crossword puzzle. "Looks like we're in for some weather," called out Eddie, the local mailman, from his perch by the window. "Those clouds are rolling in mighty fast." Maggie glanced outside at the gathering gray clouds. "Well, we sure could use the rain. My garden's been looking mighty thirsty lately." "How is that garden of yours, Maggie?" Martha asked, adjusting her reading glasses. "Those tomatoes you brought in last week were simply divine." "Oh, it's coming along just fine," Maggie replied, warming up Martha's coffee, though the rabbits seem to think my lettuce patch is their personal buffet. Her eyes crinkled with amusement as the regulars chuckled. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Wilson shuffled in, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a floral scarf. Maggie immediately noticed the slight tremor in the elderly woman's hands. "Here, let me help you with that, Mrs. Wilson," Maggie said softly, guiding her to her favorite booth. "I'll bring you your usual, cheese omelet with wheat toast." Mrs. Wilson's face brightened. "You're an angel, Maggie. Don't know what we'd do without you." The morning continued in its comfortable rhythm, with Maggie tending to her customers like family. She knew each of their stories, their joys and their sorrows. She remembered how Mr. Peterson had lost his wife last spring, and how Martha's grandson had just started college. These weren't just customers. They were her community. A strong gust of wind rattled the windows, and the door burst open with a bang. The peaceful atmosphere suddenly shifted as 5 leather-clad bikers strode in, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. The last to enter was Johnny Hurricane Miller, his Hell's Angels patches prominent on his worn leather vest. The regular customers tensed visibly. Tom's newspaper crinkled as his grip tightened, and Martha and Betty's conversation died mid-sentence. Mrs. Wilson's hands began to shake more noticeably as she clutched her coffee cup, but Maggie's warm smile never wavered. She grabbed her coffee pot and 5 clean mugs, approaching their table with the same gentle grace she showed everyone else. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said pleasantly, setting down the mugs. "Our coffee's fresh, and I'd be happy to tell you about our breakfast specials." She began pouring, the rich aroma of coffee filling the air around them. Johnny looked up at her, his hard eyes meeting her kind ones. The tattoos on his neck shifted as he swallowed, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. The tension in the diner remained thick enough to cut with a knife, but Maggie continued her work, treating the bikers with the same respectful attention she showed all her customers. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story." The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Maggie pushed through the swinging kitchen door, her comfortable shoes squeaking slightly as she moved toward the industrial-sized refrigerator. The familiar sounds of plates clinking and coffee cups being filled drifted in from the dining area. "Did you see those bikers yesterday?" She heard Betty, one of the regular customers, whisper to her friend. "Gave me the shivers, they did." Maggie shook her head and smiled to herself as she pulled out fresh lettuce and tomatoes. She'd served all kinds of people in her 40 years at the diner. Bikers, truckers, priests, and politicians. They all needed a hot meal and a kind word sometimes. The kitchen was her sanctuary, warm and familiar. She methodically chopped vegetables for the lunch rush, her skilled hands moving with practiced efficiency. The rhythmic sound of her knife against the cutting board merged with the quiet murmur of conversation from the dining room. Through the small service window, she could see Johnny sitting alone in the back booth. He'd returned early this morning, keeping to himself with just a cup of coffee. His leather vest bore the distinctive Hell's Angels patches, but something about his demeanor seemed different from the others. There was a heaviness to his shoulders, a distant look in his eyes as he stared into his coffee cup. "Order up," Sam, the cook, called out, sliding a plate of eggs and hash browns onto the counter. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and carried the plate out to table 4. The lunch preparations continued smoothly until a sudden silence fell over the diner. The bell above the door didn't chime its usual welcome. Instead, the door crashed against the wall with a violent bang that made everyone jump. "Nobody move!" a harsh voice commanded. Maggie froze at the kitchen entrance, her heart stopping as she took in the scene. A man in a black ski mask stood in the doorway, wielding a pistol. His hands shook as he pointed the weapon directly at Johnny. "Where's my money, Hurricane?" the masked man screamed, using Johnny's gang nickname. "You thought you could just disappear with it?" The other customers sat paralyzed, coffee cups suspended halfway to trembling lips. A child at the counter began to cry softly, his mother pulling him close. "Easy now," Johnny said, his voice low and controlled as he slowly raised his hands. "Let's talk about this outside. These people have nothing to do with it." "Shut up!" The gunman's voice cracked with rage. He took 2 steps closer to Johnny's booth, the gun wavering between Johnny and the other terrified customers. "I want my money now, or everybody here gets to watch you die." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the terrible silence. Maggie could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she watched the gunman's finger tighten on the trigger. Time seemed to slow down as she noticed how the morning sun glinted off the barrel of the gun, how the masked man's breathing came in ragged gasps, how Johnny's face had gone deadly pale. The gunman's arm tensed, and Maggie saw his finger start to squeeze the trigger. Time seemed to slow as the masked gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. The late afternoon sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching dust particles in its golden rays, making the moment feel surreal. The barrel of his weapon pointed straight at Johnny's chest. Maggie's hands trembled as she set down her coffee pot, her heart pounding against her ribs. She'd seen enough trouble in her 40 years at the diner to know when a situation was about to turn deadly. The gunman's eyes, visible through the holes in his mask, were wild with rage. "I said, give me the money you owe me!" the masked man screamed, his voice cracking with anger. His hand shook as he gripped the gun tighter. Johnny remained frozen in his seat, his leather jacket creaking as he slowly raised his hands. "Look, man, we can talk about this." "No more talking." The gunman took another step forward, bumping into an empty chair. Maggie saw it all, happening as if in slow motion, the way the gunman's shoulder tensed, how his finger whitened against the trigger. Without thinking, she moved. Her sensible shoes squeaked against the linoleum floor as she lunged forward. "Get down!" The words tore from her throat, raw and urgent. She threw herself toward Johnny, her small hands pushing against his broad shoulders with surprising strength. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the diner. It echoed off the walls, drowning out the screams of terrified customers. A sharp, burning pain exploded in Maggie's side, stealing her breath away. She barely felt herself falling. The ceiling tiles spun above her as she collapsed, her blue uniform darkening with spreading warmth. The pain came in waves now, each one stronger than the last. "Oh God, Maggie!" Johnny's voice seemed to come from far away. She felt his rough hands cradling her head, keeping it off the cold floor. "Someone call an ambulance!" The diner erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as people rushed to help. Through blurring vision, Maggie saw the gunman flee, the bell above the door jingling with artificial cheerfulness as he disappeared into the street. "Stay with me, Maggie." Johnny's face swam into view above her. His usually hard expression had crumbled into something raw and frightened. "Why did you do that? Why would you do that for someone like me?" Maggie tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The pain was overwhelming now, and darkness crept at the edges of her vision. She could hear Linda, one of the regular customers, crying somewhere nearby. Someone had wadded up a clean dish towel and pressed it against her side. "The ambulance is coming," Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion. He hadn't let go of her hand. "Just hold on, okay? Please hold on." Maggie could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The diner's lights seemed to dim and brighten in rhythm with her heartbeat. She felt cold despite the warmth of Johnny's hand holding hers. Through the growing fog in her mind, she was aware of paramedics rushing in. Their efficient voices called out medical terms she didn't understand. Strong hands lifted her onto a stretcher, but Johnny's grip remained steady until they reached the ambulance. "I'm coming with her," she heard him insist, his voice fading as consciousness slipped away from her. The last thing Maggie felt was the gentle squeeze of his calloused hand around hers as the ambulance doors slammed shut. Johnny paced the sterile hospital corridor, his heavy boots echoing against the linoleum floor. The leather vest he wore felt too tight, like it was squeezing the air from his lungs. Every few steps, he glanced at the clock mounted on the wall, watching as minutes crawled by like hours. A young nurse in blue scrubs approached him cautiously. "Mr. Miller, Miss Harris is still in surgery. Would you like some coffee while you wait?" He shook, his head running calloused fingers through his graying hair. The image of Maggie lying on the diner floor, blood seeping through her uniform, wouldn't leave his mind. The warmth in her eyes just before she pushed him down haunted him. No one had ever taken a bullet for him before, especially not someone like her. The waiting room filled with people from town. Old-timers who came to the diner every morning for their coffee. Young mothers who brought their kids in for Saturday breakfast. They whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Johnny. He knew what they were thinking, that this was his fault. They were right. "This should have been me," he muttered, slumping into an uncomfortable plastic chair. His hands trembled as he buried his face in them. The smell of gunpowder still clung to his clothes, mixing with the sharp scent of hospital disinfectant. Hours ticked by. Johnny watched as families came and went, doctors rushed past, and the sky outside the windows turned from bright afternoon to dusky evening. Each time the double doors opened, his heart jumped, hoping for news about Maggie. Finally, a tired-looking doctor in surgical scrubs emerged. "Family of Margaret Harris?" Johnny stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. The other waiting room occupants leaned forward, eager to hear news about their beloved waitress. "She's stable," the doctor said, consulting his clipboard. "The bullet missed her vital organs, but there was significant blood loss and tissue damage. We've managed to remove the bullet and repair what we could, but she's still unconscious." Relief flooded through Johnny's body. making his knees weak. She's gonna make it? The doctor's expression turned serious. There's hope, but the next 24 hours are critical. She's not out of danger yet. The trauma to her body was severe, and at her age, recovery will be challenging. Johnny nodded, his throat tight. Can I see her? She's in recovery now, once. She's moved to ICU. You can visit briefly. The doctor paused, studying Johnny's weathered face. Are you family? No, Johnny admitted quietly. I'm the reason she's here. Understanding flickered across the doctor's face. He'd heard about the shooting on the news. She must have thought you were worth saving. Those words hit Johnny like a physical blow. He turned away, fighting back emotions he hadn't felt in years. Through the window, he could see his motorcycle parked below, the chrome gleaming under the parking lot lights. His old life, the gang, the violence, all of it, suddenly seemed hollow. I'm gonna make this right, he whispered, pressing his palm against the cool glass. Whatever it takes, I'll make this right. The vow felt sacred in the quiet hospital corridor, witnessed only by the humming fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of medical equipment. Mr. Miller? A different nurse appeared beside him. Ms. Harris has been moved to ICU. You can see her now, but only for a few minutes. Johnny straightened his shoulders and followed the nurse, each step heavy with the weight of his promise. The woman who had saved his life lay unconscious ahead, and he knew his own life would never be the same. Johnny slumped in the hard plastic chair of the hospital waiting room, his leather jacket creased and worn. The steady beep of medical equipment from nearby rooms echoed through the sterile hallways. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing for the past hour. News traveled fast in small towns. Another call about Maggie, said the nurse at the reception desk, her voice gentle. That's the 20th one today. Everyone's asking how they can help. Johnny rubbed his tired eyes. He'd been awake for nearly 24 hours straight, unable to leave the hospital. The image of Maggie falling, of her blood spreading across the diner floor, kept playing in his mind like a horrible movie he couldn't turn off. She's got quite a following, the nurse continued, hanging up the phone. The florist called to say they're almost sold out of get-well arrangements. Everyone's ordering them for her. The waiting room slowly filled with concerned townspeople. An elderly man with a cane hobbled in, clutching a handmade card. A young mother arrived with her children, each holding small drawings they'd made for Miss Maggie. The local pastor stopped by with prayer beads and kind words. She always remembered my coffee order, said Tom, one of the regular customers, his voice cracking. Black with 2 sugars. 40 years. She never got it wrong. Remember when she helped my Sarah with her math homework? Another patron added. Stayed after her shift just to explain fractions. Johnny listened to their stories, each one revealing a different facet of Maggie's kindness. He'd never known someone could touch so many lives just by being good. Around noon, 3 elderly women arrived, Betty, Rose, and Martha, carrying bouquets of yellow daisies and handwritten cards. They were Maggie's closest friends, the morning coffee crew who'd been meeting at the diner for decades. Poor dear, Betty whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. All those years of saving, and now this. Johnny's ears perked up, though he pretended to be focused on the magazine in his lap. The insurance won't cover all of it, Martha replied softly. You know how these things are. The bills will be astronomical. She was just about to retire too, Rose added, shaking her head. Had maybe $5,000 saved up. That won't even cover a day in the ICU. Johnny's stomach clenched. He hadn't even thought about the medical bills. Of course there would be bills. Probably more money than Maggie had ever seen in her life. They said the surgery alone was over $50,000, Betty continued, her voice trembling. And who knows how long she'll need to stay here, or the physical therapy after. The women moved closer to Maggie's room, their voices fading, but Johnny had heard enough. He stood up, his legs stiff from sitting so long, and walked to the window. The parking lot below was full of cars belonging to people who'd come to show their support for Maggie. This woman, this stranger, had taken a bullet for him. She'd risked everything to save his life, and now she might lose everything she'd worked for, just to pay the bills. The thought made him sick. Through the window's reflection, he could see more people arriving with flowers, cards, and worried faces. The whole town was rallying around Maggie, but good wishes wouldn't pay the hospital bills. Johnny reached into his pocket, feeling the worn leather of his wallet. He had some money saved up from his less-than-legal activities, but it wouldn't be nearly enough. Johnny stood in the doorway of Maggie's hospital room, his leather jacket feeling heavier than usual on his shoulders. The steady beep of machines filled the sterile air. Maggie lay still, her silver hair spread across the white pillow, tubes and wires connecting her to various monitors. He took a few hesitant steps forward, his boots squeaking against the polished floor. A chair sat empty beside her bed, but he couldn't bring himself to sit down. He didn't deserve to be that close. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "That bullet was meant for me." Through the window, afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across Maggie's peaceful face. Johnny remembered how she'd smiled at him yesterday, treating him like any other customer, despite his leather vest and the patches that marked him as a Hell's Angel. No fear, no judgment, just genuine kindness. His fingers traced the worn edges of his motorcycle club patches. Each one had felt like a badge of honor once, symbols of brotherhood and belonging. Now they felt like weights dragging him down, reminders of every bad choice that had led to this moment. "You didn't even know me," he said quietly to Maggie's unconscious form. "I've done terrible things, been part of terrible things, and you—" His voice cracked. "You took a bullet for someone like me." The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway made Johnny turn. A tall man with gray hair and weathered features filled the doorway, his face hardening when he saw Johnny. "So you're the one," the man said, his voice low and controlled. "The reason Maggie's lying here." Johnny straightened up, old instincts kicking in, but he forced his hands to stay loose at his sides. "I didn't want any of this to happen." "Name's Hank," the man said, stepping into the room. "Known Maggie for 30 years. She served me coffee every morning at that diner." His eyes narrowed. "Until yesterday, when your presence brought violence to our town?" The accusation hit Johnny like a physical blow. He looked down at his boots, unable to meet Hank's steady gaze. "Your kind always brings trouble," Hank continued. "We've managed just fine without motorcycle gangs around here." "I never meant—" Johnny started. "Meant to what?" Hank cut him off. "Get a 62-year-old woman shot? Have her fighting for her life because of your lifestyle?" Each word felt like another bullet, but Johnny didn't argue. He couldn't. Hank moved closer to Maggie's bed, looking down at her with obvious affection. When he spoke again, his voice had softened slightly. "You know what she did yesterday? Before all this happened?" He didn't wait for Johnny's response. "She spent an hour sitting with old Bill Thompson, whose wife just passed. Brought him extra pie on the house. That's who Maggie is." Johnny swallowed hard, the knot in his throat growing tighter. Hank turned back to him, and something in his expression shifted. "Look, son, what's done is done, but you've got a choice now." He paused, measuring his words. "You can run back to your gang, keep living that life, or you can change. You can make things right." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Johnny looked at Maggie again, then back at Hank, seeing both judgment and something else in the older man's eyes, a glimmer of hope, maybe, or understanding. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors when Maggie's eyes finally fluttered open. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the sterile white sheets. Johnny sat slumped in a chair beside her bed, his leather jacket draped over the back, his usual tough exterior showing signs of wear after days of waiting. Maggie blinked slowly, trying to focus her vision. Her throat felt dry, and her chest ached with a deep, persistent pain. The movement caught Johnny's attention, and he immediately straightened up, leaning forward with concern etched across his weathered face. "Maggie?" His voice was unusually gentle, almost breaking. "Can you hear me?" She managed a weak smile, though it took considerable effort. "Water?" she whispered hoarsely. Johnny fumbled with a plastic cup on the bedside table, carefully helping her take small sips through a straw. His hands, usually steady from years of handling motorcycles, trembled slightly. After moistening her throat, Maggie's first real concern wasn't for herself. "Is everyone at the diner okay?" she asked, her voice still weak but clear. "Did anyone else get hurt?" Johnny shook his head in disbelief. Here she was, lying in a hospital bed after taking a bullet meant for him, and her first thought was for others. "Everyone's fine, Maggie. You're the only one who got hurt." His voice caught on the last words. "Thank goodness," she sighed, relief evident in her tired eyes. She shifted slightly and winced at the pain, but her expression remained serene. "The regular customers must be missing their coffee by now." "Don't worry about the diner," Johnny said quickly. "The whole town's been talking about what you did. They've been sending flowers, cards." He gestured to the windowsill, which was crowded with colorful bouquets. Maggie's eyes wandered to the flowers, and her smile widened slightly. "That's sweet of them." She paused, studying Johnny's face. "You look tired, dear. Have you been here this whole time?" Johnny ran a hand through his unkempt hair, embarrassed. "I couldn't leave. Not after—" He struggled to find the right words. "Maggie, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. That bullet was meant for me, and you—" "Hush now," Maggie interrupted, reaching out with a frail hand to pat his arm. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Johnny said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "Most people would have run. You saved my life, Maggie. Me, a Hell's Angel. Someone who didn't deserve it." Maggie's eyes, though tired, held a determined gleam. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Johnny. Everyone deserves to be saved." A tear rolled down Johnny's cheek, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. The simple kindness in her words broke through decades of carefully constructed walls. Maggie squeezed his arm, gently, and said the words that would change everything. "I'm just glad you're okay." Johnny stood up abruptly, overwhelmed by her selflessness. "The medical bills," he said, his voice rough with determination. "I'm going to take care of all of them, every last penny. I promise you that, Maggie." Her eyes widened in surprise, but before she could protest, a nurse entered the room to check her vitals, marking the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. The leather-clad bikers filled the dimly lit parking lot behind Joe's bar, their motorcycles lined up like dark sentinels in the fading light. Johnny stood before them, his hands steady but his heart racing. These men had been his brothers for years, but now everything felt different. "You're making a big mistake, Hurricane," growled Bear, the chapter president, his massive frame towering over Johnny. The nickname felt hollow now, like a remnant of a life that no longer fit. "That woman took a bullet for me," Johnny said, his voice firm. "I owe her everything, and I'm done with this life." Murmurs rippled through the group. Some spat on the ground, Others crossed their arms and glared. Snake, his oldest friend in the gang, stepped forward. "You can't just walk away," Snake warned. "And where you gonna get that kind of money? Medical bills ain't cheap." Johnny squared his shoulders. "I've got savings, and I'll figure out the rest. But I'm done bringing violence to innocent people." "Innocent?" Bear laughed harshly. "Since when do you care about innocent people, Hurricane?" "Since I watched one almost die for me," Johnny shot back. "You weren't there. You didn't see her face, didn't see the blood." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed on. "I'm out. That's final." The tension crackled like electricity. Bear stepped closer, his breath hot on Johnny's face. "You know the rules. Nobody leaves clean." "Then do what you gotta do," Johnny replied steadily. "But I'm still walking away." The silence stretched, for what felt like hours before Bear finally stepped back. "Your funeral, Hurricane. Don't come crying when reality hits." Johnny turned and walked away, each step feeling lighter than the last. He headed straight to the hospital, where Maggie was sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert. The evening sun cast long shadows through the window, painting the sterile room in warm colors. "Johnny?" She smiled, though he could see the pain in her eyes. "You look different today." He pulled up his usual chair beside her bed. "I made some decisions, Maggie, big ones." She reached out and patted his hand, her touch gentle but strong. "Tell me." "I'm leaving the Angels," he said quietly. "I can't be part of that life anymore. Not after what happened to you." Maggie's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull her hand away. "That's a dangerous decision, Johnny." "I know." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "But I have to do this. I'm going to take care of your medical bills, and I'm going to make something better of myself. Something you can be proud of." Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes. "Johnny, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted softly. "You saved my life, Maggie. Not just from that bullet, but from everything. You showed me what real courage looks like, what real kindness looks like." She squeezed his hand, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence. The beeping of the hospital monitors seemed to fade away as they shared this moment of understanding. "It won't be easy," Maggie finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "Nothing worth doing ever is," Johnny replied, managing a small smile. "But I'm ready for it. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I need to do." The morning sun filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the freshly mopped floor. Johnny stood behind the counter, his large hands awkwardly wrapped around a coffee pot. The usual morning crowd was starting to trickle in, and some of them still did, double takes at the sight of the former Hell's Angel wearing an apron. "You're holding it wrong," Maggie called out from her usual booth, where she sat propped up with pillows. Her voice was stronger now, though still carrying the faint rasp of recovery. "The handle needs to be at an angle when you pour." Johnny adjusted his grip, and this time the coffee streamed smoothly into the customer's cup without splashing. "Like this?" "Much better." Maggie's eyes crinkled with warmth. "You're a quick learner." The elderly man receiving the coffee, Mr. Peterson, nodded his thanks. It was a small gesture, but Johnny felt a flutter of pride. These little moments of normal interaction meant more to him than he could express. Throughout the morning, Johnny moved between tables, learning the rhythm of the diner. Whenever he felt lost, he'd glance at Maggie for guidance. She couldn't work yet, but she insisted on coming in every day, saying the familiar surroundings helped her heal during a quiet moment. Johnny brought Maggie a fresh cup of tea. "The doctor says you're healing faster than expected," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "God's grace," Maggie replied, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "And good company." She studied his face for a moment. You're different now, Johnny. I can see it in your eyes. Johnny looked down at his hands, calloused from years of working on motorcycles. I want to be better, he said quietly. But I don't know how to run a legitimate business. The gang, that's all I've known for so long. There's someone who might be able to help, Maggie said thoughtfully. Hank Patterson. He owns the hardware store down the street. He's turned his life around 2 years ago. Johnny knew of Hank, the man who had confronted him at the hospital. The thought of asking for help made his stomach twist, but he knew he needed guidance. Later that afternoon, Johnny walked into Patterson's hardware. The bell above the door chimed softly, and Hank looked up from behind the counter. His expression hardened slightly when he recognized Johnny. "Mr. Patterson," Johnny started, his voice rough with nervousness. "I need your help." Hank set down the inventory sheet he'd been reviewing. "With what?" "I want to learn how to run a business properly, a legitimate one." Johnny forced himself to maintain eye contact. "Maggie said you might be willing to teach me." Hank's expression softened at the mention of Maggie's name. He studied Johnny for a long moment, then walked around the counter. "You're serious about changing?" "Yes, sir. I made a promise, to Maggie and to myself." "It won't be easy," Hank warned. "You'll have to learn everything from scratch. Bookkeeping, inventory management, dealing with suppliers." "I'm willing to learn," Johnny insisted. "Whatever it takes." Hank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Maggie's a good judge of character," he said finally. "If she believes in you, maybe I can too." He extended his hand. "We'll start tomorrow morning, bright and early. Don't be late." Johnny grasped Hank's hand, feeling the weight of this moment. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a lifeline to a different future. "Thank you," Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." The morning sun cast long shadows across the diner's parking lot as Johnny wiped down tables, his mind focused on the routine tasks that had become part of his new life. The bell above the door jingled, and his muscles tensed at the familiar sound of heavy boots on the linoleum floor. "Well, well, look who's playing house." Vince the Hammer Rodriguez's gravelly voice cut through the quiet morning air. He stood there, his leather vest adorned with patches that told stories of violence and loyalty. Johnny straightened up, keeping his voice steady. "What do you want, Vince?" "What do I want?" Vince's laugh was cold and sharp. He moved closer, his presence filling the small diner. "I want to know why one of our best riders is suddenly playing waiter in this dump." "I'm done with that life," Johnny said, gripping the cleaning rag tighter. "I made my choice." Vince's face hardened. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Nobody leaves the Angels, Johnny. You know that better than most. Remember what happened to Mickey when he tried to walk away?" Johnny's stomach churned at the memory. Mickey had disappeared 3 years ago, and nobody ever saw him again. "I mean it, Vince. I'm out." Johnny tried to move past him, but Vince grabbed his arm. "Listen carefully," Vince growled. "You've got till the end of the week to come to your senses. After that..." He let the threat hang in the air. "And if you think that sweet old lady of yours will be safe..." He smiled, showing teeth. "Well, accidents happen all the time, don't they?" Johnny's vision went red. He yanked his arm free, fighting the urge to throw a punch. "You stay away from her," he snarled. "Make the right choice." "Johnny," Vince said, backing towards the door. "Family is forever, and we're your only family." After Vince left, Johnny's hands were shaking so badly he had to sit down. The morning sun seemed colder now, the diner's warmth stripped away by Vince's visit. Later that afternoon, as Maggie sat in her usual booth during her break from physical therapy, Johnny couldn't hide his distress. She noticed immediately, reaching across the table to touch his hand. What's troubling you, Johnny? Her voice was gentle, her eyes filled with concern. Johnny looked at her hand on his, weathered and strong despite everything she'd been through. Vince came by this morning, he admitted. He's not happy about me leaving. Maggie's grip tightened slightly. What did he say? He threatened. Johnny's voice caught. He threatened both of us, said I have until the end of the week to come back. Maggie was quiet for a moment, her face serious but calm. Are you scared? Not for myself, Johnny said, meeting her eyes. But for you. Yeah, I'm terrified. These guys, they don't make empty threats. I've lived through worse, Maggie said, her voice steady. We both have. Johnny shook his head. You don't understand. Vince, he's different. He's called the Hammer for a reason. When he wants to make a point, he makes sure it sticks. Maggie squeezed his hand again. I understand more than you think, Johnny. But running back to them won't solve anything. It'll just keep the cycle going. Johnny looked at her, at the strength in her eyes despite everything she'd been through. The shooting, the recovery, and now this. He felt torn between his promise to change and his fear of what Vince might do. I don't want you to get hurt again, he said quietly. Not because of me. Then we'll face it together, Maggie replied firmly. That's what friends do. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting warm rectangles of light across the worn linoleum floor. Maggie stood at the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pull of healing muscles around her wound. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. Are you sure about this? Johnny asked, hovering nearby. His weathered face was creased with concern. The doctor said you should rest another week. Maggie adjusted her crisp white apron with determined fingers. I've been resting for weeks. This diner is my home, and these people are my family. She patted Johnny's arm. Besides, I'm just going to be taking orders and pouring coffee. Nothing too strenuous. The bell above the door chimed as she pushed it open. The morning regulars looked up from their newspapers and coffee cups. For a moment, the diner fell silent. Then old Joe, who'd been coming in for breakfast every morning for 30 years, stood up with tears in his eyes. Welcome back, Maggie, he said, his voice rough with emotion. A chorus of greetings filled the air. Martha, the cook, rushed out from the kitchen and wrapped Maggie in a gentle hug. We've missed you something awful, she whispered. Maggie's eyes grew misty as she looked around at the familiar faces. Well now, she said, reaching for her notepad. Who needs a coffee refill? As she made her way around the diner, moving slower than usual, but with the same warm smile, customers reached out to touch her hand or pat her shoulder. Some shared stories about how the diner hadn't been the same without her. Others told her how they'd been praying for her recovery. Near the window, Mrs. Peterson and Betty Wilson, two regular morning customers, sat hunched over their coffee cups, speaking in hushed tones. As Maggie approached with the coffee pot, their words drifted to her ears. It's not right, Mrs. Peterson was saying. Having that biker around here, he's bound to bring more trouble. Betty nodded. I heard the whole gang's angry about him leaving. What if they come after him? We could all be in danger again. Maggie set the coffee pot down with a firm click that made both women jump. Ladies, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I couldn't help but overhear you talking about Johnny. The women had the grace to look embarrassed, but Maggie continued, pulling up a chair to join them. You know, I've worked in this diner for 40 years, and I've learned that people can surprise you. Johnny's trying to change his life, and that takes more courage than most people have. She touched the spot where the bullet had struck her, a gesture that wasn't lost on her audience. He could have run away after what happened to me. Instead, he stayed. He's working honest hours, learning the business, treating people with respect. That's not the action of someone who means harm. Mrs. Peterson's face softened. Well, when you put it that way. She glanced toward the counter where Johnny was carefully arranging coffee cups. I suppose everyone deserves a second chance. Betty dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. You're right, Maggie. We've been judging him too harshly. After all, if you can forgive him, who are we to hold on to prejudice? Maggie smiled, standing up slowly. Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them. Now, how about some fresh blueberry muffins? Martha just pulled them out of the oven. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows when Vince and 3 other Hell's Angels walked in. Their heavy boots thudded against the worn linoleum floor, and the bell above the door chimed an unusually ominous note. The regular customers tensed, some quietly sliding out of their booths and heading for the exit. Johnny stood behind the counter, wiping down coffee cups. His jaw tightened when he saw Vince's familiar swagger. The gang leader's leather vest creaked as he approached, his weathered face twisted in a sneer. "Well, well, look who's playing house," Vince said, his voice carrying across the now quiet diner. "Trading in your colors for an apron, Hurricane?" Johnny set down the cup he was holding, careful and deliberate. "Not here, Vince. Take it outside." "Oh, we're way past taking things outside." Vince planted his hands on the counter. "You made promises to us, brother. The Angels don't let people just walk away." The other bikers spread out, blocking the exits. Their faces were hard, unforgiving. Johnny's hands gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. "I'm done with that life," Johnny said, his voice steady but tired. "There's nothing left to discuss." "Nothing to discuss?" Vince's laugh was cold. "You owe us, and debts get paid, one way or another." From the kitchen, Maggie appeared. She moved slowly, still favoring her healing wound, but her eyes were clear and determined. She carried a pot of fresh coffee as if it were any other day. "Can I get you boys some coffee?" she asked, her voice warm but firm. Vince turned to her, his expression dangerous. "Stay out of this, lady. This isn't your business." "Actually, it is my business," Maggie said, setting down the coffee pot. "This is my diner, and these are my customers. All of them." She looked pointedly at both Johnny and the bikers. Johnny moved to step around the counter. "Maggie, please!" "No need for that, Johnny," she said, holding up her hand. Her voice carried the weight of decades of experience dealing with troubled souls. Vince's hand moved to his jacket, and the glint of metal caught the afternoon light. "Last chance, Hurricane. Come with us now, or—" Before he could finish, Maggie stepped between them. She didn't flinch at the weapon, instead looking directly into Vince's eyes. The diner fell completely silent. "I took a bullet once already in this diner," she said quietly, but her voice carried to every corner of the room. "I didn't do it just to watch more violence. There's a better way than this." She gestured around the diner. "Look around you. This place, it's where people come to feel safe, to feel welcome. Even you boys used to come here for that, didn't you? For a moment of peace with your coffee and pie." Vince's hand trembled slightly on his weapon. Maggie continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. "Johnny's found his peace here. He's choosing a different path. And deep down, you know that's his right, just like it would be your right if you ever wanted to choose differently." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Vince's eyes darted between Maggie and Johnny, his grip on the weapon tightening, then loosening. "The world doesn't have to be about violence and revenge," Maggie said softly. "There's room for change, for healing. I see it every day in this diner. I saw it in Johnny, and I can see it in you too, if you're willing to look for it." The evening air was cool and crisp as Johnny and Maggie walked side by side down Main Street. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Maggie had insisted on walking home, despite Johnny's offer to drive her in his pickup truck. "The doctor said walking would help me heal faster," she reminded him with a gentle smile. Her steps were slower than usual, but steady. Johnny walked close beside her, his leather jacket rustling with each step. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, a habit he'd developed over years on the streets. The peaceful moment was shattered by the roar of an engine. A black sedan came speeding down the street, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Johnny instinctively moved to shield Maggie, but the car merely slowed as it passed them. Something white fluttered through the air, landing at their feet. The car peeled away, leaving behind the acrid smell of burning rubber. Johnny's hands trembled as he bent down to pick up the crumpled piece of paper. Maggie watched his face grow pale as he read it. "What does it say?" she asked softly, touching his arm. He hesitated, then handed her the note. The message was crude, written in thick black marker. "You can't walk away. We'll make sure of it." Johnny ran his fingers through his graying hair, his jaw clenched tight. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They're not going to let me go without a fight, and now they're targeting you too." Maggie carefully folded the note and tucked it into her apron pocket. "Johnny," she said, her voice steady and calm. "Look at me." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with worry. The streetlights had begun to flicker on, casting shadows across his weathered face. "I've lived in this town for 62 years, Maggie continued. "I've faced down drunk customers, survived a bullet, and dealt with more hard times than I can count. We're not going to let them scare us. But Maggie, these guys, they're dangerous. They don't play by any rules. I can't bear the thought of you getting hurt again because of me." His voice cracked slightly. Maggie reached out and took his hand in hers. Her skin was soft against his calloused palm. "Listen to me, Johnny Hurricane Miller," she said, using his full name with a hint of playfulness. "I believe in you, and I believe in what we're doing. Faith and love are stronger than fear." Johnny stared at their joined hands, then at the kind face of the woman who had saved his life in more ways than one. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen the good in you," she replied. "I've watched you change, seen how hard you're working to make things right. God doesn't give us more than we can handle, and He didn't bring us together just to let us fail now." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed. Johnny felt some of the tension leave his shoulders as Maggie's words sank in. "Besides," she added with a small smile, "I've got the whole town behind me, and now they're behind you too. We're stronger together than they could ever be alone." Johnny squeezed her hand gently, amazed once again by her unwavering strength. Despite his fears, he found himself believing her. Together they continued their walk home, the threatening note forgotten in Maggie's pocket as they talked about their plans for tomorrow at the diner. Johnny's boots echoed against the worn linoleum floor of the sheriff's office. The familiar smell of coffee and old paper files filled the air as he approached the front desk. His hands were sweaty, and his heart pounded against his ribs. This wasn't going to be easy. "I need to speak with Sheriff Caldwell," Johnny said to the deputy at the desk. "It's important." A few minutes later, he found himself sitting across from Sheriff Tom Caldwell, a man with weathered features and kind eyes that had seen their share of trouble. The sheriff's office was modest, with a few family photos on the desk and a window that looked out onto Main Street. "What brings you here, Johnny?" Sheriff Caldwell leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. Johnny took a deep breath. "Been getting threats from the gang." He pulled the crumpled note from his jacket pocket and placed it on the desk. "They're not just coming after me anymore. They're threatening Maggie, too." The sheriff picked up the note, reading it slowly. His expression grew serious. "This is serious business, son. But you know how this works. We can't offer much protection unless you're willing to help us first." "What do you mean?" Johnny asked, though he already knew the answer. "We need someone on the inside, someone who knows names, dates, locations." The sheriff set the note down and folded his hands on the desk. "In other words, we need you to testify against them." The words hit Johnny like a punch to the gut. He stood up and paced the small office, running his hands through his hair. "You don't understand what you're asking, Sheriff. These guys, they don't forget. They don't forgive." "I understand perfectly well," Sheriff Caldwell replied, calmly. "But you came to me for help. This is the help I can offer." Johnny stopped at the window, watching people walk by outside. Regular folks living regular lives. Something he'd never known. "They'll kill me if I testify, and if they can't get to me, they'll go after everyone I care about." "We can put you in witness protection," the sheriff offered. "Give you a new life, a fresh start." "And Maggie?" Johnny turned back to face him. "What about her?" "She could be protected too, if necessary." The sheriff's eyes softened. "Look, Johnny, I've watched you these past few weeks. You're trying to change, and that's admirable. But sometimes doing the right thing comes at a cost." Johnny sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I'd lose everything. My identity, my past. Sometimes that's the price of a second chance," Sheriff Caldwell said quietly. "Think about it. You could help us take down some seriously bad people, make the town safer, give Maggie the peace she deserves." Johnny stared at his hands, remembering all the things they'd done over the years, all the mistakes, all the wrongs. Could testifying make up for any of that? "I need time to think," he said finally. The sheriff nodded. "I understand. But don't take too long. These threats?" He held up the note. "They're just the beginning. And next time it might not be just words on paper." Johnny stood up, his legs feeling heavy. The magnitude of what he was considering, betraying the Brotherhood, turning state's evidence, it went against everything he'd lived by for years. But then he thought of Maggie, of her kindness, her courage, of the bullet she took for him. "I'll let you know soon," Johnny said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's all I can ask," Sheriff Caldwell replied, standing to shake his hand. "Whatever you decide, make sure you can live with it." The evening sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows, painting stripes across Johnny's weathered face as he sat alone in his usual booth. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten while he wrestled with the weight of his choices. The sheriff's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "We need your testimony to bring them down." Johnny's calloused hands wrapped around the ceramic mug, seeking comfort in its familiar shape. The diner was quiet now, most of the dinner crowd gone. Only the soft hum of the overhead fans and distant clinking from the kitchen broke the silence. He glanced at the spot where Maggie had fallen, taking the bullet meant for him. Though the floor had been cleaned weeks ago, he could still see it in his mind. The memory made his chest tighten. How many others had been hurt because of the gang? How many lives had they ruined while he looked the other way? Through the window, he watched as cars passed by on Main Street, their headlights cutting through the growing dusk. Normal people living normal lives. That's what he wanted now, what he'd never thought possible, before Maggie showed him another way. "Testifying means burning every bridge," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his graying hair. "Maybe ending up dead in a ditch somewhere." The gang had ways of dealing with traitors, and he knew too much about their operations to be allowed to walk away clean. The bell above the door chimed softly. Johnny didn't need to look up to know it was Maggie. He recognized her gentle footsteps, slightly uneven now from her healing wound. She slid into the booth across from him, her kind eyes taking in his troubled expression. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, folding her hands on the table. Johnny managed a weak smile. "Not worth that much, Maggie." "Oh, I doubt that." She reached across and patted his hand. "You've got that look again, like you're carrying the whole world on your shoulders." He met her gaze, seeing the understanding there. "The sheriff wants me to testify. Against the gang. All of it. The drug running. The protection rackets. Everything." Maggie nodded slowly, letting him continue. "I know what they're capable of," Johnny said, his voice dropping lower. "I've seen it firsthand, been part of it. And now—" He shook his head. "Now I'm thinking about turning on them." "You're thinking about doing what's right," Maggie corrected gently. "Let me tell you something, Johnny. When I first started working here, I was scared of everything. Scared of failing, scared of being alone, scared of making the wrong choices." She touched her side, where the bullet had struck her. "But I learned something over the years. Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right, even when you are scared." Johnny absorbed her words, studying the lines in her face that spoke of years of quiet wisdom. "When I jumped in front of that bullet," she continued, "I wasn't thinking about being brave. I was just doing what needed to be done. Sometimes that's all we can do. What needs to be done? One step at a time." Her words settled over him like a warm blanket, and for the first time since his meeting with the sheriff, Johnny felt his shoulders relax slightly. Here was someone who understood sacrifice, who had lived it. Looking at her now, seeing her strength despite everything she'd been through, Johnny felt something shift inside him. "You're something else, Maggie Harris," he said softly. "You know that?" She smiled, the warmth reaching her eyes. "We all have our moments, Johnny. We all have our moments." Johnny sat at the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. He'd made his decision. He would testify against the gang. The weight of years of guilt seemed to lift slightly from his shoulders. "More coffee, hun?" Maggie asked, limping slightly as she made her way behind the counter. Though still recovering, she insisted on keeping busy. "Thanks, Maggie." Johnny managed a small smile. "I've decided to do it. I'm going to talk to the sheriff today." Before Maggie could respond, the diner's door burst open. 3 men in leather jackets stormed in, led by Vince. The few early morning customers froze in their seats. "You're making a big mistake, Johnny," Vince snarled, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket. Johnny stood slowly, positioning himself between the gang and Maggie. "Leave now, Vince. This isn't the way." "You think you can just walk away?" Vince's face twisted with rage. "After everything? After all the secrets you know?" The tension in the diner crackled like electricity. An elderly couple near the door quietly slipped out, while a young waitress ducked behind the counter. "I'm done with that life," Johnny said firmly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "We can all walk away from this." Vince pulled out a gun, and screams erupted throughout the diner. "Nobody's walking away from anything!" Everything happened in a blur. Johnny lunged forward, trying to grab Vince's arm. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the small space. Johnny felt a sharp burn across his shoulder as the bullet grazed him. "Johnny!" Maggie's voice cut through the chaos. More shots rang out as the other gang members drew their weapons. Dishes shattered, and coffee cups exploded on tables. Johnny wrestled with Vince, desperately trying to point the gun away from the customers. Through the struggle, Johnny heard Maggie cry out. He turned to see her clutching her chest, red spreading across her uniform. She swayed for a moment before collapsing behind the counter. "No!" Johnny's anguished scream filled the diner. He slammed Vince against the wall, knocking the gun from his hand. The sound of sirens pierced the air. Someone had called the police. Vince and his men fled, leaving Johnny to rush to Maggie's side. She lay pale and still, blood seeping through her fingers. "Stay with me, Maggie," Johnny pleaded, pressing his hands over her wound. "Please, not again. I'm so sorry." Maggie's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Not your fault," she whispered. The paramedics arrived within minutes, pushing Johnny aside as they worked to stabilize her. He watched helplessly as they lifted her onto a stretcher, her normally vibrant face now ashen and drawn. "She's losing blood fast," one paramedic shouted. "We need to move." Johnny tried to follow them to the ambulance, but a police officer held him back. "Sir, we need your statement." Through the window, Johnny watched the ambulance pull away, its sirens wailing. The diner, usually so warm and welcoming, now felt like a crime scene. Broken glass everywhere, bullet holes in the walls, and Maggie's blood staining the floor where she fell. A detective approached Johnny, notepad in hand. "We need to know everything about these men, Mr. Miller. Everything." Johnny nodded numbly, his grazed shoulder forgotten in his worry for Maggie. Morning sun continued to shine through the windows, indifferent to the violence that had just shattered their peaceful world. Johnny sat in the cold hospital chair, his leather jacket pulled tight around him. The steady beep of monitors filled the sterile air as he watched Maggie's chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. Tubes and wires snaked around her fragile form, making her seem smaller than ever. His calloused hands trembled as he reached for hers. "I'm so sorry, Maggie," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "This is all my fault. Everything I touch, everyone I care about." The bruises on her face were turning purple now, stark against her pale skin. The doctors had said she'd lost a lot of blood, and the next 24 hours would be critical. Johnny hadn't left her side since they brought her in, except when the nurses forced him to step out. Hank stopped by earlier with coffee and a sandwich, but Johnny couldn't eat. The guilt churned in his stomach like acid. He'd promised to protect her, to change his ways, but instead, he'd brought more violence to her doorstep. "You should have let me take that first bullet," he murmured, squeezing her hand gently. "Should have just walked away from me. I'm not worth all this, Maggie. I'm just not." The monitors beeped steadily, offering no comfort. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the room in soft orange light. Johnny remembered how Maggie always loved this time of day at the diner, when the sunset would stream through the windows and make everything glow. A nurse came in to check Maggie's vitals, offering Johnny a sympathetic smile. "Talk to her," she suggested softly. "Sometimes they can hear us, even when they're unconscious." After she left, Johnny cleared his throat. "Remember that first morning you served me coffee?" he said. "You didn't look at me like I was some kind of monster. You just smiled, asked if I wanted cream or sugar." He wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. "Nobody ever treated me like that before, like I was just normal." Hours passed. Johnny dozed off occasionally but jerked awake at every change in the monitor's rhythm. When morning came, he was still there, holding her hand, praying to a God he wasn't sure would listen to someone like him. Around noon, he felt a slight pressure on his fingers. His head snapped up to see Maggie's eyes fluttering open. "Maggie," he breathed, hardly daring to hope. Her lips moved slightly, and he had to lean in close to hear her whisper. "Johnny." "I'm here," he said, tears filling his eyes. "I'm right here. I'm so sorry, Maggie. This should never have happened to you." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Not your fault," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. "How can you say that?" Johnny's voice cracked. "Look at what my past has done to you. Twice now you've nearly died because of me." Maggie's eyes, though tired, held that same warmth he'd come to know so well. "I don't regret anything," she whispered. She took a shallow breath before continuing. "I've always believed in second chances. Always will." Johnny bowed his head, overwhelmed by her forgiveness. Her words, though soft, carried the same strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. Even now, lying in a hospital bed because of his mistakes, she still believed in him. "You rest now," he said gently, brushing a strand of gray hair from her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere." Maggie's lips curved into a small smile as her eyes drifted closed again, but this time her hand remained warm and responsive in his. Johnny sat beside Maggie's hospital bed, his rough hands gently holding her frail ones. The steady beep of monitors filled the sterile room. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Maggie," he whispered, his voice cracking. "This is all my fault. Everything that's happened to you. You don't deserve any of it." Maggie squeezed his hand, weakly. Her face was pale, but her eyes held that same warmth they always had. "Johnny," she said softly, "stop blaming yourself. We all make choices in life. I chose to help you, both times. But look where it got you." He gestured at the hospital room, the tubes, the machines. "You could have died. But I didn't." Maggie's smile was gentle. "Sometimes the right path isn't the easy one. I believe in you, Johnny. I always have." Johnny wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't understand how you can forgive me so easily." "Because I see the good in you," Maggie said. "The man who's been visiting me every day, who's been working honest hours at the diner, who wants to make things right. That's the real you, Johnny." Her words hit him hard. Johnny stood up and walked to the window, trying to compose himself. When he turned back, his face was set with determination. "I'm going to make this right," he said firmly. "No more running. No more hiding from what needs to be done." Maggie nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Whatever you decide, I'm here for you." Johnny leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Get some rest. I'll be back tomorrow." Later that afternoon, Johnny found Hank at the diner, going over some paperwork in his usual booth. The older man looked up as Johnny slid into the seat across from him. "I need your advice," Johnny said without preamble. Hank set down his pen and studied Johnny's face. "This about the gang?" "I'm going to turn them in," Johnny said. "All of them. Everything I know about their operations, their hideouts, their deals, everything." Hank was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face serious. "That's a dangerous road you're choosing, son." "I know." Johnny's hands clenched on the table. "But I can't let them hurt anyone else. Maggie's in that hospital bed because of them, because of me." "You understand what this means?" Hank leaned forward. "You'll need witness protection. You'll have to leave everything behind." Johnny nodded. "I know, but I have to do this. For Maggie. For myself." Hank rubbed his chin, considering. Finally, he sighed. "Well, I guess you'll need someone to help you through this mess." He reached across the table and patted Johnny's arm. "Count me in, son. Whatever you need." Relief flooded Johnny's face. "Thank you, Hank. I mean it." "Don't thank me yet," Hank warned. "This won't be easy, but—" He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. I'm proud of you for making this choice." Johnny swallowed hard, touched by the older man's words. For the first time in days, he felt like he was on the right path, no matter how difficult it might be. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Johnny took the stand. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady as he faced his former gang members. Sheriff Caldwell stood near the door, his presence reassuring. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of the gang members, their expressions dark with betrayal. "I was there for all of it," Johnny testified, his eyes never wavering from the truth he had to tell. The drug runs, the violence, the threats. Each word felt like lifting a weight from his shoulders, but also drove home the reality of what he'd been part of for so many years. From her seat in the courtroom, Maggie watched Johnny with pride. She sat straight despite the lingering pain from her injuries, her gentle face showing nothing but support. When Johnny's eyes met hers during particularly difficult moments of his testimony, he found the strength to continue. The prosecution presented evidence after evidence, building an irrefutable case against the gang. Johnny's testimony was the final piece they needed. Sheriff Caldwell had worked tirelessly, gathering additional witnesses who, encouraged by Johnny's bravery, came forward with their own stories. As the verdict was read, Johnny felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The gang members, including Vince, were sentenced to long prison terms. The judge's gavel came down with finality, and just like that, his old life was truly over. Outside the courthouse, the spring sun felt warmer somehow. Johnny stood on the steps, taking deep breaths of fresh air. Maggie approached him slowly, her cane tapping against the concrete. "You did it," she said softly, reaching for his hand. Johnny squeezed her fingers gently. "We did it. I couldn't have found the courage without you, Maggie." Sheriff Caldwell joined them, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "You made the right choice, son. It won't be easy, but you've got a real chance at a fresh start now." "Thank you, Sheriff," Johnny said, meaning it from the bottom of his heart. Later that evening, Johnny and Maggie sat in their usual booth at the diner. The place was quiet, the last customers having left for the day. The setting sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges, streaming through the windows and casting a gentle glow across their faces. Maggie poured them, both coffee, her movements slower than before but just as graceful. "What's on your mind?" she asked, noticing Johnny's thoughtful expression. "Just thinking about everything that's happened," he replied, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "A few months ago, I was lost in a life I hated. Then you took a bullet for me, and everything changed." "Life has a funny way of working out," Maggie said, her eyes twinkling. "Sometimes the hardest moments lead us exactly where we need to be." Johnny nodded, looking around the diner that had become his sanctuary, the place where he'd found redemption, and more importantly, where he'd found Maggie. The future still held many uncertainties, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face them. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee as the day's last light faded. The diner's neon sign buzzed to life outside, casting its familiar warm glow through the windows. Despite the challenges that lay ahead, there was peace in this moment, a peace that neither of them had expected to find, but both had helped create. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the freshly polished counter of what used to be just another empty storefront on Main Street. Now, a brand new sign hung proudly above the door: Second Chance's Coffee and Diner. Johnny stood back, his hands on his hips, surveying the work of the past few weeks. Maggie appeared beside him, her recovery evident in the spring in her step. "It looks perfect," she said, sliding her hand into his. The diner was everything they'd dreamed of during those long conversations in the hospital, a place where anyone could find acceptance and a fresh start. "I still can't believe we did it," Johnny muttered, his voice thick with emotion. The renovation had been tough work, but every nail hammered and every wall painted had felt like steps away from his old life. The wooden tables gleamed, each one hand-restored by Johnny himself. Old motorcycle parts had been repurposed into unique light fixtures, transforming symbols of his past into something beautiful. Maggie squeezed his hand. "Well, you better believe it. The health inspector signed off yesterday, and we've got people coming in less than an hour." The layout was similar to Maggie's old workplace, but with their own touches. Photos of the town's history lined the walls, including one of Maggie in her younger days serving coffee. There was even a corner dedicated to second chances, featuring success stories from the community. "You know what makes this place special?" Maggie asked, adjusting a flower vase on one of the tables. "It's not just the coffee or the food, it's the idea that everyone deserves another shot at life." Johnny nodded, thinking about how far he'd come. The leather jacket was gone, replaced by a crisp white apron. His hands, once clenched into fists, now carried plates of comfort food and cups of steaming coffee. "I wouldn't be here without you, Maggie," he said, softly. The bell above the door chimed, and Hank walked in, carrying a large basket. "Thought you might need some of Martha's famous muffins for the big day," he said, setting the basket on the counter. His initial skepticism of Johnny had transformed into genuine support over the past months. More people started arriving, familiar faces from around town, each carrying something to contribute to the celebration. Mrs. Peterson brought her legendary apple pie. The hardware store owner, who'd helped Johnny with the renovations, arrived with his whole family. The diner quickly filled with laughter and conversation. Children pressed their faces against the glass display case, admiring the freshly baked goods. Elderly couples settled into the comfortable booths, nodding approvingly at the menu's familiar comfort foods. Mayor Thompson stepped forward, tapping a spoon against his coffee cup. The crowd fell silent. "Today, we're not just celebrating a new business," he announced. "We're celebrating two people who showed us that love, faith, and second chances can transform lives." Johnny wrapped his arm around Maggie's shoulders, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. The elderly regulars from Maggie's old diner had claimed their usual spots at the counter, making themselves right at home. Even some of the town's most skeptical residents had shown up to offer their support. Maggie beamed at the gathered crowd, her eyes bright with happy tears. "Welcome to Second Chances," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "where every cup of coffee comes with a side of hope." The assembled crowd broke into applause, their faces reflecting the joy of the moment. As Johnny looked around at their new beginning, he couldn't help but marvel at how a single act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that had changed not just his life, but an entire community. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the newly polished counter. Johnny stood behind it, wiping down the surface with careful attention. The place looked different now, fresher, brighter somehow. The old sign outside had been replaced with a new one that read, "Miller and Harris Diner," its letters gleaming in gold and red. Maggie sat at her usual spot, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Her recovery had been long, but the sparkle in her eyes was as bright as ever. She watched Johnny work, a small smile playing on her lips. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought I'd see the day when this place would get such a makeover." Johnny paused his wiping and looked up. "Sometimes I still can't believe it myself, that you'd want to go into business with someone like me." Maggie shook her head. "There you go again with the someone like me talk." She took a sip of her coffee and set it down deliberately. The past is just that. The past. Forgiveness isn't just about saying sorry, Johnny. It's about accepting that we all deserve a second chance at happiness. Johnny leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about that day a lot, when you took that bullet for me. His voice grew quiet. Nobody had ever done anything like that for me before. Well, Maggie said with a gentle laugh, I hope nobody ever has to do it again. She reached across the counter and placed her hand over his. But that moment changed both our lives, didn't it? Sometimes the hardest times bring us exactly where we need to be. The bell above the door chimed, and Hank walked in, carrying a small box. Morning, you two, he called out. Got those new menus you ordered, Johnny? Johnny straightened up, grateful for the familiar face. Hank had become more than just a mentor. He was now a trusted friend. Thanks for picking those up. Want some coffee? Don't mind if I do, Hank replied, settling onto a stool next to Maggie. Place is looking good, real good. As Johnny poured Hank's coffee, more regulars began filtering in. Mrs. Peterson, who once clutched her purse tightly whenever Johnny was around, now greeted him with a warm smile. Tom from the hardware store clapped him on the shoulder as he passed, asking about their weekly chess game. It's like night and day, Maggie observed quietly to Hank. Remember how scared everyone was of him at first? Hank nodded, watching as Johnny chatted easily with a group of elderly customers. People can surprise you. Johnny sure surprised me. That's because you gave him a chance, Maggie said. We all need someone to believe in us. Sometimes that's all it takes. The morning crowd grew steadily, filling the diner with the comfortable buzz of conversation and laughter. Johnny moved between tables with an ease that would have seemed impossible months ago. He'd learned every regular's order by heart, just as Maggie had always done. As he worked, Johnny caught glimpses of his reflection in the diner's windows. The man, looking back at him, was different from the one who'd first walked through these doors. His eyes were clearer, his shoulders straighter. The weight of his past, while not completely gone, had lightened considerably. You're doing just fine, Maggie said, appearing at his side with a fresh pot of coffee. She could still read his thoughts like an open book. Thanks to you, Johnny replied. No, she corrected him gently. Thanks to forgiveness, and a little faith in second chances. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting a warm glow across the freshly polished counter. Johnny stood behind it, wiping down the surface with careful attention, while Maggie arranged fresh flowers in a small vase. The breakfast rush had ended, leaving them with a quiet moment to talk. You know, Maggie said, adjusting a daisy, I never thought I'd see this place so busy again. Your changes to the menu have really brought people in. Johnny smiled, his weathered face softening. It's not just the food. People come here because of you, Maggie. Always have. She waved off the compliment, but her eyes sparkled. Well, I've been thinking. She paused, straightening her apron. Maybe we could do more. What do you mean? Johnny set down his cloth and leaned against the counter. Remember old Mrs. Peterson? She can barely make it to the diner anymore. And there are others like her, folks who could use a hot meal but can't get here easily. Johnny nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. You're thinking about deliveries? More than that, Maggie said, pulling up a stool. What if we started a program? Maybe set aside some meals each day for people who need them. The community helped us when we needed it. Maybe it's time we returned the favor. Johnny ran a hand through his graying hair. That's gonna cut into our profits. Since when did you become such a businessman? Maggie teased, reaching across to pat his hand. Remember what Hank taught you about giving back? Yeah, Johnny chuckled. He'd never let me forget it. He paused, considering. You know what? We could do better than just meals. I know some folks who need work, people trying to turn their lives around like I did. Maggie's face lit up. You mean hiring them here? Why not? Give them a chance, like you gave me. Johnny's voice grew serious. There are people out there who just need someone to believe in them. We could train them, Maggie added, warming to the idea. Teach them the business from the ground up. Johnny nodded, his excitement building. And not just in the kitchen. We could help them learn about running a business, managing money, all the stuff Hank taught me. It would mean more work, Maggie cautioned, though her smile never wavered. Good thing we're not afraid of hard work, Johnny replied, reaching for the coffee pot to refill their cups. You taught me that too. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee and watching the morning light dance across the diner's worn tiles. You know what this means, don't you? Maggie finally said, her eyes twinkling. We'll need to expand the kitchen. Johnny laughed. One step at a time, Maggie, but yeah, I can see it. A bigger kitchen, maybe even a second location someday. He reached across and squeezed her hand. As long as you're with me on this. Always, she replied softly. We make a good team, you and I. That we do. Johnny stood up straighter, his expression determined. All right then, let's start planning. We can talk to Hank about the business side of things, maybe reach out to the church about finding people who need help. And I'll start working on a training program, Maggie added, pulling out her notepad. Something simple to start, but thorough. As they began jotting down ideas, the morning light grew stronger, filling the diner with promise. Their simple restaurant was about to become something more, a place of second chances, just like the one they'd found together. The warm spring breeze carried the sound of laughter and music through the diner's open doors. Colorful streamers and balloons decorated the newly expanded dining area, where dozens of people mingled, enjoying coffee and Maggie's famous apple pie. A handmade banner hung across the entrance. First annual Second Chances community fundraiser. Johnny stood behind the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee pot, watching the scene with quiet amazement. A year ago, he wouldn't have believed this moment possible. Now here he was, serving coffee to the same townspeople who'd once crossed the street to avoid him. Need a refill? He asked an elderly woman who'd been coming to the diner for decades. She smiled and nodded, holding out her cup. You know, Johnny, she said, her eyes twinkling. I never thought I'd say this, but you make better coffee than Maggie does. Don't let her hear you say that, Johnny chuckled, filling her cup. I learned from the best. Across the room, Maggie moved between tables with the same grace she'd always had, though maybe a bit slower since her injuries. She stopped to chat with everyone, her silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight. She was wearing her favorite blue dress, the one she said matched the color of hope. Hank appeared at Johnny's side, clapping him on the shoulder. Look at this turnout, he said, gesturing to the crowd. We've already raised enough to help 3 families with their medical bills. Johnny nodded, thinking about his own journey. It's what Maggie would have wanted. Actually, it's what she's always done, helping others. I'm just following her lead. The fundraiser had been their idea, a way to help families struggling with unexpected medical expenses, just like Maggie had faced. The whole town had pitched in, donating items for the silent auction and volunteering their time. Mayor Thompson stood up, tapping his glass for attention. I'd like to say, few words about our hosts, he began. A year ago, this town witnessed something extraordinary. We saw how one act of kindness could change not just 2 lives, but an entire community. Johnny felt Maggie's hand slip into his as they listened. Her touch was warm and reassuring, just like always. Maggie and Johnny have shown us what it means to believe in second chances, the mayor continued, Through their example, we've learned that it's never too late to change, to forgive, to begin again. Johnny glanced around the room. There were former gang members he'd helped find legitimate work, elderly patrons who'd become like family, and young people who now saw hope where they'd once seen only dead ends. After the speeches, as the afternoon light began to fade, Johnny and Maggie stepped outside onto the small patio they'd built behind the diner. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Maggie asked, leaning against the railing. Johnny shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not in a million years. I was too busy running from everything good in life. And now?" "Now?" Johnny turned to look at her, at the woman who'd changed everything by believing in him. "Now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. The sounds of the fundraiser drifted out from the diner, voices laughing, dishes clinking, lives being changed one small kindness at a time. In that moment, surrounded by the peace they'd fought so hard to find, Johnny and Maggie simply existed together, two souls who'd found their purpose in helping others find theirs. The autumn sun painted the diner's windows in warm, golden light as Maggie wiped down the counter, her movements smooth and unhurried. The place was empty now, closed early for their special celebration. 1 year had passed since everything changed, since bullets and fear had given way to love and hope. Johnny stood by the register, counting out the day's earnings with careful attention. His leather jacket hung on a hook by the door, replaced by a crisp white apron. The sight made Maggie smile. How far they'd both come. "Remember when you first walked in here?" Maggie asked, her eyes twinkling. "All rough and tough with your biker friends?" Johnny looked up, a gentle smile softening his weathered features. "How could I forget? I was trying so hard to look mean, but you just kept serving coffee with that smile of yours." "I knew there was good in you, Johnny Hurricane Miller." Maggie moved closer, placing her hand over his. "Even before you proved it to everyone else." The cash register clicked shut, and Johnny turned to face her fully. "You saw something in me I couldn't even see myself, Maggie. Taking that bullet for me, it changed everything." "God works in mysterious ways," Maggie said softly. "Look at us now, running this place together, helping folks who need second chances." Through the window, they could see their Second Chances sign hanging proud above the diner's entrance. The new addition to their business, a training program for people trying to turn their lives around, had already helped dozens find their feet. "The charity dinner last night was something else," Johnny said, pulling out 2 cups and filling them with fresh coffee. "Did you see old Hank's face when we announced the scholarship fund?" Maggie accepted her cup with a nod. "He pretended he wasn't crying, but I saw him dabbing his eyes. 5 kids will get to go to trade school next year because of what we've built here." They settled into their favorite booth, the one where everything had started. The bullet holes had long since been patched, but the memory remained, not as a reminder of violence, but of transformation. "You know what amazes me most?" Johnny reached across the table, taking Maggie's hand. "How you never once doubted me. Even when the gang came back, even when you got hurt again, you just kept believing." "Love's like that," Maggie replied, her voice warm and sure. "Real love doesn't give up when things get hard. It gets stronger." The setting sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the diner floor. On the walls, photographs told their story, newspaper clippings about their community work, pictures of graduation ceremonies from their program, smiling faces of people who'd found their way back to hope. "Sometimes I wake up thinking this is all a dream," Johnny admitted, his thumb tracing circles on Maggie's palm. That I'll open my eyes and be back in that dark place with all that anger and emptiness? But you're not. Maggie squeezed his hand. You're right here where you belong, helping others find their way just like you did. Johnny nodded, emotion making his voice rough. Because of you, Maggie. Your love changed everything. Our love, she corrected gently. And all the good we've done? That's just the beginning. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Their coffee grew cold, forgotten in the warmth of the moment. In that peaceful quiet, they both knew. This was what redemption felt like. This was what it meant to be truly home. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.